Hello everyone and welcome to this week's lecture. This is the fifth and final lecture on the module. There won't be one about the films next week, but there will be a little foretaste of what you can expect with those. However, this is the last formal lecture, and this one is of course about the Harry Potter texts and about the Roald Dahl book The Witches. It also starts to think about film because of course both of these texts are works that have been made into films, and in the case of The Witches very recently so I'd like you to watch that film, The Witches 2020, before the seminar if you can. That would be really helpful. I've called the lecture Harry Potter and the Angry Critics, which is partly just a little joke about the shape of the Harry Potter titles. But also this is quite an angry week on the module. It's because we live in an era of what people have come to call culture war. Both of these texts have become embroiled in that, and of course, as you will know with the Harry Potter books, that's particularly true of them. The books, the films, the subsequent story continuations, both those by Rowling and other people, have become embroiled in really angry disputes about the meaning of the text, the status of the characters, and issues like sex, gender, empowerment, race, and so on. So these texts have picked up on some of the issues that we've discussed already on the module, and they've been debated in a very binary form. So I'm going to talk about that. This week's lecture does contain a lot of material which is about people being angry with each other, about hostility and about some pretty upsetting issues. So there's a little content warning at the start of it. But please talk to me if you're in any way worried about any of the issues that I'm going to talk about this week. And you can see what they are by looking at the slides for the lecture. So, off we go. I'm going to start in a relatively uncontroversial place. One of the ways to approach both of these books is as children's literature, and I want us to think about that category a little bit. And particularly with the Harry Potter books, you can think about them as school stories, a very traditional genre for children to read. And particularly, it's been argued by literary critics, a British one, because of the British system of public schools, which means, of course, schools which are not public, are not state schools, but are in fact private schools run by groups of individuals or by foundations on a profitable basis. So they are schools with fees, in case you're not familiar with that system. So when I say public schools, that's what I mean. And literary critics have argued that because of the British public school system, quite often British stories about schooling are themed around that world. And they are drawn, therefore, inherently into issues about the economy, about class, about access to education. And this has made them quite politicised. And clearly you'll know from your reading around and from your own knowledge over the years, I imagine, of the discussions around the Harry Potter books and the subsequent cultural activity around Harry Potter, that this has become an issue that people have become very angry about, among so many others, in the ways that they've debated the books. So I'm going to start talking about school stories first of all. The second slide is just the covers, and again there's that theme about marketing and covers and readership. So the covers of some of the older school stories in British culture. So for example, Tom Brown's School Days is one of the earliest British stories, a Victorian story about a boys' public school. The others are ones that actually I read as a kid. My mum had these books, so I read Charm's Last Chance, and I read the Mallory Towers stories, and I read the Chalet School stories, all of which are essentially stories for girls and young women about girls' public schools. Some of them are really quite interesting, and they've been written about quite extensively from the viewpoint of how they shape young female readers. So, you know, like you, although I'm clearly not the generation who read the Harry Potter novels as a child, and I didn't have children to read them to either. So I feel I've kind of missed out quite a bit on that phenomenon. But I read other school stories as a child myself, and so I also feel, I think we live these stories in a different way to the ways that we perhaps live adult fiction. And I want us to think about that in the course of the module this week as well. Also, please be gentle with each other. When we read books as children, when we watch films as children, we do quite often develop strong memories associated with these. You know, they mean a lot more to us, I think, because we are approaching them as younger people, younger readers, younger viewers. So be gentle and respectful with each other. And there's another little bit later on about my giving you a little bit of a warning about the way that you discuss these. But from what I've seen of the module discussions so far, you know, you guys are more than capable of having sensible, sane discussions about all of these issues, and that gives me hope. So that's good. Here are some of the covers then of some of those earlier works, and you'll notice there's a big boom in mid-20th century fiction here. So these are demonstrably stories from the 20s, 30s, 40s and 50s. Look at the clothing of those who are depicted on the covers, for example. There was a big boom in children's publishing in the mid-20th century, and the idea of children's literature as being a genre in its own right was really developed then. Before that, school stories were doing some interesting things to do with the kind of social realism, the social conscience novels, the social problem novels that we were talking about with our discussion of Elizabeth Gaskell. They were very much in that mould, in that genre. And part of that was, as I said, about the politicisation of certain kinds of education in Britain. But some of it was also because that was what fiction did in those days. The idea of realism was important, as we've seen in previous discussions on the module, and school stories were no exception. They were expected to discuss the real world, and therefore the issues that they raised were those essentially in microcosm of those which novels for adults raised in macrocosm. So school stories tended to participate in that discourse of social change, of realism, of activism. And of course, Charles Dickens is perhaps the most famous writer of not school stories in the entirety of his novels, but certainly many of his novels contain a section where the hero goes to school. And in some cases, like Nicholas Nickleby from 1839, he does that as a teacher, as a master, which is an interesting word in the context of the discussions we're having about power in the course of this module. So Nicholas Nickleby is a story that particularly engages with the school story genre, and Dickens uses it to make social commentary, as in this section here. A bare and dirty room is how he describes the schoolroom, with a couple of windows, whereof a tenth part might be of glass, the remainder being stopped up with old copybooks and paper. There were a couple of long old rickety desks, cut and notched and inked and damaged in every possible way. 2 or 3 forms, i.e. benches, a detached desk for Squeers, who is the main master of this school, and another for his assistant, and that will be our hero Nicholas Nickleby. But the pupils, Dickens says, the young noblemen, this is what Nicholas has been promised will be the clientele of this particular school. How the last faint traces of hope, the remotest glimmering of any good to be derived from his efforts in this den, faded from the mind of Nicholas as he looked in dismay around. Pale and haggard faces, lank and bony figures, children with the countenances of old men, deformities, as he puts it, with irons upon their limbs, boys of stunted growth, and others whose long, meagre legs would hardly bear their stooping bodies, all crowded on the view together. There were the bleared eye, the hare lip, the crooked foot, and, as he puts it, every ugliness or distortion that told of unnatural aversion conceived by parents for their offspring, or of young lives which from the earliest dawn of infancy had been one horrible endurance of cruelty and neglect. This is a pretty horrible picture, isn't it? He describes these children as disabled and rejected by their parents, partly because of their appearance. There were also other issues at play here, though. There were little faces which should have been handsome, darkened by the scowl of sullen, dogged suffering. There was childhood with the light of its eye quenched, its beauty gone, and its helplessness alone remaining. There were vicious-faced boys brooding with leaden eyes like malefactors in a jail, and there were young creatures on whom the sins of their frail parents had descended, weeping even for the mercenary nurses they had known, lonesome even in their loneliness. There's a reference there to venereal disease. The sins of their frail parents is Dickens's way of alluding to the Victorian concern about particularly syphilitic venereal diseases, which, like many venereal diseases, are passed on to children conceived as a result of the sins of their frail parents, as he puts it here. So there is a lot of stuff going on here in this section. And he sums up by describing school as hell, which is one of those tropes that we often think about in contemporary society. Think of the Hellmouth in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, for example, as a depiction of school as literally hell. With every kindly sympathy and affection blasted in its birth, with every young and healthy feeling flogged and starved down, with every revengeful passion that can fester in swollen hearts eating its evil way to their core in silence, what an incipient hell was breeding here. So here are some of the parameters of the school story. It will engage with social issues. It will engage with groups of children who are often in some way seen to be disadvantaged. Think, for example, of Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre as well, where Lowood School is a similar environment for girls who have been rejected unfairly by the adults around them and driven away, in some cases to starve to death, or to become so ill at the school that they die. There is some really nasty social commentary going on here, and Dickens uses the school story for political ends. However, although school stories have this long history of engagement with the very difficult social issues of the Victorian period, they do also offer us a lot of pleasures, and particularly as we enter the 20th century and the mid-20th century, school stories are one of the primary forms of entertainment that children could access. What do they offer them? The next slide makes some suggestions. I think to start with, community is really important. You know, you can belong to a school in a fictional work in a way that perhaps you don't belong to the school that you actually attend, if you're lucky enough to do that. You can belong to a team where perhaps, particularly in the real world, you don't. You can have a non-domestic public world which is different from the one which is actually available to you. You can also experience some exotic elements beyond the world that is available to you in an even greater and broader sense. So, for example, you can travel widely in school stories. There is often a section in the school story which involves the travel of the individuals who are going to be educated to that setting, and sometimes they're coming home again. There is an element of change. There is an element of changing up the environments available to the young readers in a school story. There's also an element of procedural. So just like a police procedural or a law procedural, a kind of generic TV series which goes through repeatedly week after week the arrest and conviction of felons and the social issues around that, and looks at the teams who are doing the work in a fictional way. You know, the NCIS CSI procedural, that kind of thing. There's also the fictional learning scenario, which is a type of procedural. It's about people sitting in classrooms learning stuff, and in a sense it doesn't matter what they're learning. What the reader is doing is participating in that procedure with them, which is a kind of satisfaction that people often derive from school stories. There's also the notion of special or secret knowledge, which isn't available to parents or guardians or adults. And on top of that, of course, in the stories that we're looking at, there's an added magic, which is sort of part of that special secret knowledge. After all, magic is often regarded as occult or hidden knowledge. It's occulted because it's blurred, it's hidden, it's in darkness. But what does this permit, this added magic in these cases? Again, we go back to the issue that I've raised in a couple of the previous weeks about what magic adds to texts. If you take a very well-established genre like the school story and you add magic to it, what changes? What more is possible? So here are some of the issues for you to think about with regard to genre. And I want to move on specifically to looking at the Harry Potter novels. And I want to look at the way that they've been sharply divisive. And I think partly that is because they are school stories, so people see them as particularly sensitive. They are to be read by children. They are to be consumed by children in the form of film or websites, and parents and other adults get very anxious about this kind of content, particularly with the long background of the school story as being intended to educate, as being intended to be activist, to affect social change, to deal with political issues. Oh my goodness, that's an explosive mix, isn't it? Political issues, young readership. So I'm going to look at just two of the ways in which the Harry Potter books have been consumed and reviewed in this section of the lecture. And that's around the issue of social conservatism. So the first slide looks at the way that some conservative Christians, particularly in this case American conservative Christians, have regarded the Harry Potter series as anti-conservative. You can find online a range of these kind of views, and I must stress they're not all Christian groups. So people come at these texts from a variety of different positions, and it's only really extreme conservative Christian groups that have a problem with the Harry Potter novels. But my goodness, when they had a problem, they had a problem, and you can see some examples of that which make this look comparatively mild. However, this is what a website run by Edward Meeks, who has branded himself the courageous priest, this is what it has to say about the Harry Potter books. Harry, Ron and Hermione lie, cheat and steal and harm others, so that someday Voldemort will be defeated. Muggles are pathetic and or despicable fools. Perfectly normal, boring, law-abiding, square owners of square houses, Muggles, non-magical people, as exemplified by the narrow-minded, hideous Dursleys and the timid, inept Prime Minister, are nuisances or burdens to Harry and company, pawns or targets to Voldemort. I haven't gotten into the vulgar language. This is all his italics and bold. So this is the way that he writes about these texts. I think you can see the passion, the anger beginning to build in this discussion. That's one of the issues I want to look at this week. I haven't gotten into the vulgar language, the gross conversations and the sexual innuendo. There are erotically suggestive scenes, Myrtle visiting Harry in the bath. There is the total absence of God, except as a name in casual oaths. There's the approval of euthanasia, Snape dispatching the ailing Dumbledore. Spoilers. There's the brutality of magical pranks, and this by the good guys. There, in superabundance, are sick jokes about death and torture. There's the scatological humour. Toilets and bathrooms feature as the locales or tediously disproportionate share of the action. There's that blending of solid ethical principles with amoral sophistries. There is, throughout the entire saga, the constant utilitarian rationalisation for immoral acts. The courageous priest objects particularly to the idea that the ends do justify the means. So because Voldemort will be defeated, any form of activity, however low and corruptible and contemptible and so on, is validated, is permitted in order to ensure that he is defeated. He's very concerned about that, and that's one of the interesting suggestions behind some of the criticism of the Harry Potter books by these kind of Christian groups, that this is insufficiently godly, because although some of the characters are seen to be good, yet nevertheless they are not good enough. They may be combating evil, but they're not doing it in good enough ways. So some people have regarded the Harry Potter franchise as being anti-conservative. Others, on the other hand, have regarded it as inherently conservative, as you can see on the next slide, and literally conservative with a capital C in this case, which makes this a particularly effective contrast, I think, with the last slide. This is what Robert Winder had to say on a BBC website in 2005 about the Harry Potter books. The series paints an unrealistic picture, he said, of Britain in 2005. In fact, Harry Potter often reminds me of John Major, who was then the Prime Minister. There might not be much to connect the young wizard and the former Conservative Prime Minister at first glance, apart from a passing resemblance, but it seems to me that their vision of Britain could be the same. John Major believed the UK to be a country of long shadows on cricket grounds, warm beer, invincible green suburbs, and old maids bicycling to Holy Communion throughout the morning mist. Harry Potter, I think, also represents this long-forgotten Britain of the 1950s in many ways. Living at a boarding school, so a public school in the British sense of the word, he inhabits a world of duelling practice, of housemasters, of pet rats and harmless games. It is a world where good and evil are clearly defined. Note the explicit contrast with the previous reviewer, who thought they were insufficiently clearly defined, and not one with many grey areas and dangers familiar to children and young adults today. So for this reviewer, the series is too conservative. It is too much mired in the past of the school story. It is too socially and politically conservative in its focus on that boarding school environment. And he regards this as a poor series, a poor role model for contemporary children, who he thinks will not find in it the kind of issues that confront them in their real lives. No, you have to think about where you sit on that continuum of views, and it's quite a broad continuum, to be fair, quite a broad spectrum. We'll come back to this in the course of the lecture going forwards. But first of all, exercise 1. I want you to reflect in the module forum about what your first impressions of the Harry Potter books were. When did you first read them? What did you think about them? Did you become a fan of them? Were you skeptical about them? Some people didn't read them at all, and that's absolutely fine. You did not have to participate in this phenomenon in order to be able to comment upon it. So tell us about your lived history of this series. You are the generation that primarily consumed it. What did you have to say? What are your stories? Also have a think about what I said about the venomous aspects of the debate this week, the angry aspects. The fact that these are books for children, that they seem to be impressionable, that they're reading for education as well as pleasure, is important this week on the module. What do you think about this issue? Should children's literature offer role models, as expected by both The Courageous Priest and Robert Winder in their reviews of the text? And do they offer good role models or not? Finally, is children's literature even a helpful category? Can we think about these as children's literature? Or are they more complicated than that? And we'll look again at these issues in the second and third parts of the lecture. But again, just a reminder, be gentle to each other. These texts were very much beloved and are very much beloved by many people and hated with equal venom by many other people. And of course, that's become more complicated over time, something I'm going to address later on in the lecture because of J.K. Rowling's own comments and the relationship of those to the Harry Potter books and films. So please be respectful. There are a lot of memories riding on this for a lot of people, particularly of your generation. Okay,